macabre, gruesome and horrifying, ghastly, of pertaining to, dealing with, or representing death, especially its grimmer or uglier aspect, of or suggestive of the allegorical dance of death. Prepare yourself for these macabre moments.
I'm Marie Samuels. He's Eric Altman, and welcome to the November episode of Macabre Moments. Now, with November 13th being the 46th year anniversary of the DeFeo murders, and December 18th marking the 45th anniversary of the Lutzs moving into the infamous Amityville house, we thought it was appropriate to have Laura DiDio on as our guest. She was the reporter who was given exclusive access to George and Kathy Lutz right after they fled the house in Amityville. And she also had exclusive access to the subsequent investigation that was performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren and a small team that they brought with them. She is also a professional writer, investigative reporter, and a tech analyst. Please welcome Laura DiDio to the show. Laura, thank you so much for taking some of your time to speak with us today about Amityville.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I have to say that I've never been haunted by Amityville, but it's followed me, and it's never really been off my radar since 1976.
Well, and I mean, it's so sensational. It was probably the most well-known haunting case in the States, right? Like, I can't think of one that would be more well-known than the Amityville horror.
Well, it's gained a lot of notoriety. I'm always wary of absolute superlatives. So let's just say it's in the top 5. Ironically, I live only 17 miles away from the Conjuring house, made famous by, yes. And I was there in February too. So yeah, I guess it's all relative. It's all relative, but certainly Amityville has the Amityville story and various incarnations of, factionalized, fictionalized books, movies, plays, etc., have been ongoing, for the past 45 years. It just the interest in it never seems to wane. If anything, over the past few years, it's been gaining momentum, and nobody could have predicted that. And sometimes I just scratch my head and say, why? But there are now third generation Amityville devotees, aficionados, that really want to know every last detail about this story.
And I would be one of those people. But that's because the story in its entirety, not just Kathy and George Lutz's experience, but what happened before the Lutzes moved in. I think yes. I think almost everybody knows of the Amityville horror and have at least a general understanding of a family that moved into a house. They stayed there for roughly 30 days and then split, never to return. But a lot of people probably don't know the true crime that happened a year prior. So I was kind of hoping we could touch on that really quick. If you wouldn't mind recounting what happened with the DeFeos.
Yes, absolutely. And the DeFeo story is much more macabre, if you will, and tragic than the Lutzes and their recountings of the haunting. And in a nutshell, the highlights of that is that the DeFeo family, Ronald DeFeo Sr., his wife Louise, and their 5 children, Ronnie Jr., Allison, Dawn, John, and Mark, moved from Brooklyn in 1964-65 to Amityville. And Louise Briganti DeFeo's father had a Buick dealership, and he was the one who actually, I think, was paying the mortgage on the house. So the DeFeo family moved from, middle class neighborhood in Brooklyn to a very, very beautiful upscale neighborhood in Amityville, Long Island, which is in Suffolk County. It's about 50, 60 miles from New York City. The location is just idyllic. There's, the house had everything. It was 3-story Dutch colonial, probably about 4,000 square feet. If you count the basement, it had a finished basement, 3 floors, everything you could want in a house. There was an in-ground swimming pool, a large backyard, a boathouse, a dock outside, where what they call the canal in Amityville is actually the Amityville River. So, and then, you only have to go a couple of miles and you've got the ocean right there, the Atlantic Ocean. And it's a beautiful upscale neighborhood. So into this neighborhood moves the DeFeo clan. And if anybody, sees any television or movies about Italian families, that they're loud, boisterous, etc. That's the way they're depicted. Not all Italians, obviously, are loud and boisterous. But the DeFeo family was, and both Ronnie Sr. and their son Ronald Jr., a.k.a. Butch, worked at the father-in-law and the grandfather Briganti's Buick dealership in Brooklyn. So the interesting thing over the years is that Ronnie DeFeo, who was 23 when he committed the murders, he had problems since he was 13. He had attacked one of his grandfathers. The parents sent him to see a psychiatrist, which was unusual, you figure, in the late 60s. And he had dropped out of high school. He was sort of a ne'er-do-well. He had a job, as I said, at the Briganti Buick dealership, but it was a menial job. He was a gopher. They sent him to, make bank deposits, pick up parts, for the shop. And he had a contentious relationship with his father, Ronnie Sr., or AKA Big Ronnie, as they called him. And they both, the DeFeos, particularly the father, did not spare the rod, but he spoiled the child. So a lot of people around town, Ronnie Jr., Butch, never really broke the law, but he was on the cops' radar, if you will, a little bit, because he was around town. He was sort of a wise guy, a punk. The father would give him an allowance of several $100s a week sometimes. He had a car, he had a boat, he had rifles in the house. And he and the father would get into arguments that would turn physical. There was a fist fight in the basement in front of the other 2 brothers. Ronnie did not like the family Old English sheepdog, Shaggy. And the dog did not like him, by the way. The dog figures very prominently into this story. And he, I guess the dog bit him a couple of times. And Ronnie tried to smack the dog and wanted to get rid of it. But the father, Big Ronnie, said to him, if anything happens to that, whatever happens to that dog will happen to you. If the dog ends up in the canal, you'll end up in the canal. If the dog, has a broken leg, you'll have a broken leg. So Ronnie Jr., Butch, had a lot of money. He had a job that was menial, but he had a lot of time on his hands to go out, party, get drunk, get high. And by getting high in the 70s in New York, what you're talking about is everything from pot to all the way up to heroin, which was pretty big. So about a year before the actual November 13th, 1974 murders, Ronnie did take a gun to his father and pulled the trigger, but the gun did not fire. So Big Ronnie, the father, thought, oh, wow, it's a miracle. I've been saved. And they had a lot of religious statues, as I'm sure people have seen on the front lawn. They called the house High Hopes, but they had the statues on the front lawn. And Ronnie Sr. Got involved in, sending money to a monastery up in Canada, Brother Andre, and he would have him say masses for him, etc. There has been talk that while the DeFeos lived there, they had a priest come over to say mass in the house with all of the windows closed, and supposedly the candles on the makeshift altar all blew out. But certainly what triggered the murders was about a week or a week and a half before the actual murders. Ronnie and another employee at the Brigante Buick dealership were supposed to make a bank deposit of $20,000. They were gone for a few hours, came back and claimed that they were mugged and robbed. So no $20,000, etc. Well, Ronnie Sr., Big Ronnie, did not buy the story. And he, of course, was watching Ronnie Jr. And lo and behold, Ronnie was spending money like a drunken sailor, new wardrobe, this, that, and the other thing. So there was, a lot of friction over that. Ronnie could also, Jr., fight with his younger brothers over things like, well, he didn't like the fact that they didn't flush the toilet in the bathroom. He complained during his trial that his mother was a lousy cook. He supposedly fought with his sister, Dawn. So basically what happened with the murders, I think things were coming to a head with the father pressuring him, what happened with this $20,000? There was no robbery. You were the culprit. So Ronnie was high that night, and he was downstairs in the basement watching TV, drinking, smoking pot, whatever else. And somewhere around 3:15 in the morning, while the rest of the family slept, he went upstairs to his bedroom, got his Marlin rifle, high-powered rifle. It did not have a silencer on it. And he started in the parents' bedroom on the second floor. He shot his father first, 2 shots. 2 shots for Louise. This was at close range. Then he went across the hall and shot his sister Allison and the 2 brothers, Mark and John. And he then went upstairs. He had told one of the detectives in his confession, when they were asking him about it, did anybody wake up? And he said, well, Dawn, who was on the 3rd floor, she woke up and yelled out, is that you, Butch? And he says, yeah, Dawn, go back to bed. Everything's going to be all right. That part of the story has always seemed strange to me, as in not unreal or not real, because who hears shots like that and thinks, is that you, Butch?
Right.
Okay, and doesn't get up to investigate. For that matter, now, it only took him about 15 minutes, by the way. 8 bullets, close range, 15 minutes to kill his entire family. And he stood there. One of his brothers, he shot him. He was hit in the spine, so the spinal cord was severed. And he described to the detective how he stood there and watched, the brother dying, his youngest brother dying in the bed with the foot twitching, and apparently he didn't have much of a reaction, which in itself is pretty abhorrent.
Yeah, I was going to say psychopathic, but yeah.
Well, see, that brings up another thing. So basically, he went upstairs. He very calmly, over the next hour, discarded his bloody clothes, went around the house to pick up the spent shell casings, showered, packed the gun and the bloody clothes and the shell casings into pillowcases. He ditched the rifle in a nearby in the canal, and then he went to Brooklyn and threw the pillowcase with the bloody clothes into a sewer. He then went to work as usual and claimed to be, he phoned the house several times, said, "Oh, gee, nobody's answering." And then later that night, or late afternoon, he ran into Harry's bar and said, my family has been murdered. My family's been murdered. Call the cops. And so they did, and a couple of people went over to the house with him, and at first they just saw, I think the two dead bodies, the mother and the father, and who had been, dead for, at that point, probably 15, 16 hours. So at first, and when they took Ronnie into protective custody, the Amityville police, he was crying, a lot of histrionics, and who could have done this? And he came up with he offered various scenarios: a mafia hit person, a guy named Lou Fellini, who was, a known criminal. I mean, all sorts of things. But one thing that was clear, it didn't take the cops long. Within, I would say the first 30 hours, they zeroed in on Ronnie as the main suspect.
Well, the first thing that strikes me as funny, well, not the first, but is why didn't he pick up the phone and dial 911 from the house? Why did he go to the bar and ask for help?
Well, he had been, I think what he did was he drove back up to the house, pretended to go in
and discover them,
and then run out, "Help, help, my whole family's been killed." Yeah.
But still, why not pick up the phone?
Well, that's the $64
million
question. I mean, there is a lot of why ifs, but I mean, his attempts to try and cast blame on someone else were pretty flimsy when you think about it. Just as the so-called stolen $20,000 from his grandfather's Buick dealership, saying he was robbed on the way to the bank, people weren't buying that either. Well, at least his father wasn't. And he was pretty stupid, because instead of sitting on the money, he started buying himself a new wardrobe, getting drugs, having a good time over the next 2 weeks.
Right.
But clearly the father was amping up the pressure. There was also a lot of talk at the time that the parents had $100,000 or $200,000 in cash in the house, by the way, which has never been recovered, but supposedly jewelry, etc. So there was the parents did have one of those metal, cash boxes or lock boxes in the closet in their house, which ended up being empty. So no cash, by the way, to this day has ever been discovered, although while Ronnie was in jail awaiting trial, and even in prison afterwards, he had talked about this money and that he had buried it in a park somewhere, but it's never resurfaced. It's sort of like the great, the disappearance of D.B. Cooper and all of that money.
Right.
From the plane crash out on the West Coast there.
Yep.
But there were many strange things about it. The murder itself, which to this day have no good explanation. Why did nobody really wake up?
Now that's the thing that troubles me the most about the DeFeo murders is that he fired a 35 caliber Marlin rifle 8 times in the dead of night. Nobody woke up, no neighbors heard any gunfire, and I pulled up a YouTube video and I'm going to play the audio right now if I can find it of what a 35 caliber Marlin sounds like when it's being fired.
One more gun here I'm going to sight in. This is a 35 Marlin. This was my very first deer rifle I ever got when I was 14. Like I said, it's open sights, so pretty much if I can hit the plate, I'm doing good. I'm shooting a Federal 200 grain bullet. I've shot many deer with this gun too, and when before I got into scopes and stuff like that, it's a good gun. It puts them down pretty fast. It puts a pretty big hole in them. So let's give her a try.
Did you guys hear that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's crazy.
And that could be heard reverberating probably for a good mile. And when you think about that rifle going off, a 35 caliber Marlin going off in the confines of a house, in one bedroom, the bedrooms of the parents and Allison and John and Mark were 20, 30 feet apart.
Yeah. So now I know that they did toxicology reports and they didn't find any sedatives or any drugs in any of the victims.
That's true. And, so how is it now? Certainly when the father got shot, Ronnie Sr. got shot the first time, and the first bullet went in to his back and hit the left lung, and it exited out. The bullet went clean through and it, boomeranged off, the headboard. He started to rise up out of his bed. And clearly the mother, Louise, was in bed next to him. So she had to have heard something, but it happened so fast, she probably did not have time to react. I mean, she also had the bullet shatter, her chest, her lungs, the liver, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But the 3 kids who were at least only 20 or 30 feet away, Allison was 13, the 2 boys were 9 and 12. So kids have very keen senses at that point in time. They were only 30 feet away. How they did not hear it is unbelievable. And I'll tell you, in the book, the best book that I have seen in all of the many books about Amityville is called High Hopes, The Amityville Murders, which was written by Gerard Sullivan, who was the Suffolk County prosecutor who tried the case. Ooh. And his co-author was Harvey Aronson, who's a veteran journalist who contributed, who worked at Newsday. He has a Pulitzer Prize. He has written several books, including The Defense Never Rests, The Killing of Joey Gallo, etc. So he was a very experienced crime reporter, and as was Gerard Sullivan in terms of being a prosecutor. And in the epilogue of the book, what Gerard Sullivan said was that he still thinks about the DeFeo case, especially the children, and he wonders about the questions that were never answered. And I'm quoting here directly from the book. Did any of the victims wake up? If so, why didn't any of them defend themselves? Why were all 6 found face down in death? And why didn't anyone hear the shots? That's just creepy. Now, in fact, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say it really is.
Yeah, and anybody, if you're out in the country even, you hear shots. I live in a cul-de-sac with 6 houses, and I'm surrounded by woods on 3 sides. It's now hunting season, and I can hear the shots going off all the time. So how is it?
And they're probably miles away.
No, they're right. They're within a couple of 100 yards or sometimes closer. But the
Yeesh.
point is, the Amityville house is also near the water. It's near the Amityville River. That should amplify the sounds. It was in the dead of night. They were not near a major highway or thoroughfare. So there was not a lot of traffic going by.
No, not a lot of ambient noise, period. I mean, in 1974, TV went off the air. I want to say at what, 2 a.m. or at midnight or whatever. Like people wouldn't even be watching TV at that time of night.
That's true. Except for the night owls, and there are always a few. But the only thing that anybody heard was there was a high school, one of the neighbors 2 doors away, John Nemeth, who was in high school at the time. He was 15 or 16. He heard Shaggy the dog howling incessantly for about 15 or 20 minutes at the approximate time Ronnie was committing the murders. But the next door neighbors on the other side, the Irelands, claimed that they heard nothing, nor did any of the others. But I mean, that's a densely packed neighborhood.
Well, and it's really, really odd too that he would hear the dog, but not the rifle.
Well, the dog was howling incessantly. So the dog Shaggy knew what was going on, clearly. And it's just very sad. But
let me ask you just one more question. Do you know what happened to Shaggy?
That's actually a sad sort of story. Finally, what happened was Shaggy was taken off to the local animal shelter, and about a couple of weeks later, I think a family friend did go and claim him, but otherwise the relatives were not going to claim him. And I could understand, both sides of the family. Louise's father showed up when the cops were there, and he was trying to get through the police lines. He wanted, before they put his daughter, his son-in-law, and his 4 grandchildren into the body bags, and he wanted to go in and kiss them. And he said on the witness stand, he did not, during the trial, he did not care about the blood. He wanted to kiss his daughter goodbye and his grandchildren. He was very upset. And at first, by the way, Butch's relatives, Ronnie Jr.'s relatives, did believe, or wanted to believe desperately, his story that his protestations and denials that he did not have anything to do with the murders. But it took Detective Dennis Rafferty, I think, about 10 hours, 2 days after the murder, to get a confession out of him. And I'm sure many of your audience might know this, but when he asked Ronnie what happened after he, killed the father and the mother, why did he do it? He says it just happened so fast, and once he started, he couldn't stop. And I think that is the closest and truest explanation that we've ever heard about why he did it. Because subsequently, his story has changed many, many times over. Mm-hmm. And he has tried to point the finger of blame at Dawn, Lou Fellini, who, by the way, did show up to talk to the prosecutors and the detectives, and he had an airtight alibi. But it was sad because one of his aunts on his father's side, she would visit him, Mrs. Procida, in jail, and she really wanted to believe that her nephew was not guilty. And it clearly, as time went on, became, very clear that Ronnie was the perpetrator, no matter how many different stories he concocted.
Right.
So it was, and you have to understand, Amityville is, especially back in the 70s, bedroom community, very upscale. They hadn't had a murder there in about 100 years.
And now
So-
they have 6 in one night.
And it's very gruesome, it's very gory, and the town did, come together. So when people showed up at Harry's bar or some of the local watering holes, after the murders to try and figure, get some perspective on it, they were met with a lot of silence. But privately, the people who knew Ronnie, the neighbors, the cops were not surprised, especially about the fact that he killed the father.
Right,
But you
right.
wonder why he felt the need to kill
Everybody
the
else.
4 siblings. Well, if the mother is laying next to the father, then she's a goner. Sort of
Right.
like the Menendez murders, where Eric and Lyle Menendez, they claimed that the father was very abusive to them physically, sexually. But the mother, how did they explain killing the mother, Kitty? Especially when she ran around the house and they followed her to actually, finish her off.
Right.
But it's because she was a witness. So in Louise DeFeo's case, she was laying in bed right next to the father. When they talked about, when the cops were talking about to Ronnie in trying to obtain the confession, again, he was critical of his mother's cooking. I don't know very many Italian boys who don't like their Italian
Mom's
cooking.
cooking, yeah.
Exactly. You could understand the father because that was a very contentious relationship, to the point where not only did they get into fisticuffs in the house, but also they were wrestling around. He and his father would wrestle around on the front lawn. And one day Ronnie took off in the car, and the father got in his car and, zoomed down the boulevard after him. And, the neighbors considered this rather crass behavior. But the younger DeFeo children were all going to the local Catholic school, St. Martin de Tours. They were well liked. They were well mannered. They did not act like they had, a lot of money. And in fact, Allison used to like to go, and she was friends with the police chief's daughter. And she liked to go over to their house rather than stay at home because of the, sort of, warlike atmosphere, the tension that existed at home because of,
Right.
Between her father and
Eldest brother, yeah.
Yeah. And the youngest boy actually was in a wheelchair. He had hurt his leg playing football, so he would have needed help to get out of bed. But how they were all found face down in bed, why nobody even attempted to move, is a mystery. People do think that Dawn might have waked up but went back to sleep. And actually, the way he shot Dawn and Allison, it was a very close range. And Allison, it was very gory. There was blood and brain matter, on the walls. I mean, he got both of the sisters in the head, neck, and face.
Right.
So that, and by the way, when the Lutzes moved in, they were still cleaning residual makeup and, not makeup, but blood and gore off the walls and things.
So yeah, let's move on to the Lutzes. Now, the house remained empty after the DeFeo incident for about a year.
Correct.
And then the Lutzes come across this screaming deal at 112 Ocean Avenue.
Yes.
And they decide they're gonna, and they're aware of what occurred in the house prior.
You could not live on Long Island without and not know what had happened. It was front page on all of the major newspapers in Manhattan, New York Daily News, the New York Post. It was in the New York Times, any of the tabloids, plus Long Island Newsday, the Long Island Press, Long Island Star Journal, all of the TV stations, carried the story.
And when they bought the house, is it true that there was also the DeFeos, a lot of the DeFeos property was still in the house, like their furniture?
Yes, what happened was and I had spoken to Mr. Briganti, Louise's father, at the time, and they had taken very few things. All those pictures that were on it wasn't pictures, it was oil paintings that the father had commissioned of the family. He took those, but they did not want the rest of, most of the rest of the property. So yes, so the Lutzes bought the beds that Dawn, Allison, and the boys slept in.
It's my understanding that they actually negotiated a $400 price to. They said, well, we'll pay an extra $400 to obtain all the property that is in the house existing.
I don't know if I can't confirm the $400 figure, but I'm sure that they got it at a very, at a fire sale price.
Right. So they moved in December 18th, 1975.
Correct.
And how did things play out from that point on?
Well, the way they told the story when I spoke to them, they started, having some things happen right away that they didn't necessarily the first few days connect to anything. George, of course, famously said he could never get warm, and he kept building fires in the, big fires in the fireplace. Kathy, spent a lot of time in the kitchen and felt very languorous. But when relatives, they basically said to me that when the kids went to school and brought their friends home, none of the neighborhood kids wanted to stay there. Kathy also said her aunt, who was a nun, came by with another nun to see the house, and they became ill and left. And then, of course, they had the local priest who had married them, Father Ray Pecoraro, come over to bless the house, and he encountered, he heard a voice telling him, "Get out," and he got smacked or punched in the face. And I met Father Pecoraro while he was visiting the Lutzes after they had fled the house. They were living with Kathy's mother in her home in West Babylon, Long Island. And I asked him, did that happen? And he said yes. He was very quiet. And at the time, by the way, today, the Catholic Church is very open about the fact that they train priests to be exorcists, and they get training. They are sent to Rome for training. And Pope John Paul II, the late, who is now Saint John Paul II, he performed 2 exorcisms in his lifetime.
Wow.
And at the time, what happened was the Brooklyn, the Amityville diocese basically did not want Father Pecoraro talking. He did appear on one episode of the TV series In Search Of, which was hosted and narrated by Leonard Nimoy.
Yes.
But that was about it. And again, today, not only does the Catholic Church send priests, over to be trained as exorcists, but they have a public relations office to field calls about hauntings and exorcisms that they might be doing out in, it's based in Chicago. So they're very open about it today. But at the time, no, that was a no-no. But the Lutzes also claimed their personalities began to change, that they acted like drill sergeants around the kids and would hit the kids with a wooden spoon. Melissa, or Missy as she was called, was 5 years old. She was the youngest of the 3 adopted Lutz children, and she famously had the imaginary playmate Jody, who could morph into different shapes, a pig, a dog, a cat, and she did not seem traumatized by it. a lot of people have debunked that and said, oh, it was the neighbor's cats, who was looking in the window because George claimed he saw red eyes. The two boys up in their bedroom, which I think was Ronnie's room, found.
And to be clear, that's the room with the very recognizable windows that have since been changed out.
Yes, the quarter windows that look like eyes looking
Yep.
at you. By the way, it's interesting because the boys found some of the rifles and ammunition in the closet still.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. And one night the boys were in bed and they claimed that this dark figure, wraith-like figure, came into the bedroom. Danny, the oldest, who was 9 at the time, was sitting in the kitchen with his mother, Kathy, and they said they felt something like go right through them, like whoosh.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy also famously, and this has been reported quite a bit, and she herself commented on it in several documentaries, said she looked in the mirror one day and her face was that like of an old hag.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these, and then of course there's the flies. I never saw flies congregating when I was there, but I can tell you nowadays with global warming, I have the Japanese ladybugs, the beetles, that always seem to be out, by my bathroom window. But I never saw a lot of these things, and a lot was made of the so-called red room in the basement, which was not really a room. It was just sort of like an alcove type closet thing. And
wasn't it under the stairs?
Yes. Yeah. So it could be like a storage space. And the reason, by the way, it was not painted red because it was a portal to hell or anything to do with the supernatural or the devil. What had happened was Ronnie DeFeo Sr. decided there was a big sale on red paint at the local hardware store, and he told his kids and nephews and their friends, hey, go down and buy this paint and let's paint this room. Little did he know that
a year later it was going to be the portal to hell.
portal to hell, and it would launch 24 movies and be dissected left and right. But yeah, so one thing that's been always puzzling to me about the Amityville story is, if you're going to have a story about a haunting, I'm just really surprised that nobody has claimed that the house is haunted by the spirits of the murdered DeFeos.
Right.
It's always been very unspecific as to what is there, demonic presence, etc., or
the souls of the family that was murdered there. I mean, that would be the natural deduction or assumption with the Lutzes dealing with what they were dealing with. Well, that probably stemmed from the tragedy that happened a year before. But one might also go down the DeFeo road where they lived in the house for many years and had no problems at all, but maybe Ronnie was involved in some sort of ritualistic magic or who knows, right? And maybe he got involved into something that came into the house and then stayed and prompted him to do what he did and then stayed in the house. But what puzzles me also is, since the Lutzes have left, everybody else that's lived in the house since then has not reported any kind of paranormal activity, any kind of oddness, cold, temperature issues, anything.
Marie, let me jump in there real quick and throw something in there.
Okay, please do.
I became good friends with Christopher Lutz. He now goes by Christopher Quarantino. He won't use his last name as Lutz anymore because he basically despised George. And for sensationalizing the story and really making it more than what it was. Now, when I've talked to Chris, and I've had dinner with him several times, and we've sat down and talked about it, and I even had him on my podcast when I was doing a podcast, Chris told me that things in the house did happen. There were some paranormal things and some things that he couldn't explain, but they were over sensationalized for the book and, of course, the movie. And he said, and he even admitted that George himself was into occult-like practices.
Oh, yeah.
Messing around with things he shouldn't have been. And that's why he grew this disdain towards George. So I just want to throw that in there as to a possible reason why there might have been some paranormal activity going on in the house.
And only associated with the Lutzes.
Exactly.
Well, first, it's. Let me correct you. Let me take one thing at a time. Okay, so first of all, Marie, it's not quite true that nobody else has experienced anything since the Lutzes were in there.
You have a point, because we need to get to your visit to the house.
Yes. But other people who have lived there subsequently, okay, so have seen things. It's just been kept quiet. And at various times, there were a couple of realtors who went in there to look at the house when it was for sale, and they were the assigned realtors. And one person in particular went in, and he talked about, the two of them were in there together. It was a man and a woman. And he talked about, the feeling of, he felt very creeped out, and he couldn't wait to get out there.
Right.
And he did talk to an NBC reporter about it at the time. And when Brian Wilson, who owned the house after the Lutzes, it was the Cromartys, and they famously claimed, they sued the Lutzes for saying the place was haunted. But, they had to know, if you're the next guy in there after somebody's claimed there's a haunting in New York City, that they were opening themselves up to a lot of unwanted attention,
right?
Shall we say, putting it politely. But Brian Wilson, who was in there subsequent to the Cromartys, one of his nieces wanted to interview him about living in the house. So she took over her tape recorder. She was a student at the time. And allegedly, when she went to replay the interview, she heard white noise on the tape. Okay. As for Christopher, I've kept in, I keep in touch with him, and Eric, pretty much what you said, Christopher has said, and he and Danny have both talked about George going out into the garage and supposedly practicing, doing spells and incantations. So a word about that, though. I mean, both he and Kathy, it was the 70s. I think, they probably, they drank wine. They probably did some recreational marijuana. But any of us could sit down and get a grimoire and try and cast spells and conjure things up. And that doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Right, sure.
Okay, and it is true, George was a very tense individual who always seemed to be on edge, which one could say, if you believe those experiences that he and Kathy say occurred, it makes sense. Christopher also has reason to, dislike George over a proposed book that George was going to do, in which it was a fictional book many years later, in which the premise of the story was Christopher would move back into the house and became possessed. Unfortunately, they never consulted Christopher about this. And so when he found out about it, he ended up initiating legal action against George.
Wow.
And Christopher, I remember he, Danny, and Missy as children. And I have to say, Kathy Lutz was a wonderful mother. The kids were polite. They did household chores. Danny was very, very devoted to his mother. And Danny was the older one at 9. Christopher was 7. So Danny was not going to like anybody who took his father's place. And he did not like George. He would glare at him. And Danny refused to be cowed. Christopher was the middle child. And he always reminds me of Peter Brady from the Brady Bunch.
Right.
Okay. And he had this head of curly hair, and he was the most delightful 7 or 8-year-old. But he was a little bit afraid of George. You know, he was always looking furtively over his shoulder, or, you know, to see if George was around when he was going to say something to me. But Christopher is a very, very nice fellow. And I think both he and Danny are still to this day traumatized by what happened to them there. Not just in the house and anything supernatural, but don't forget, these were kids who had to go to school. Their lives were uprooted. They ended up moving from New York to California and then Arizona. And their parents were on tour, and they didn't get to see their father, their real father.
Biological, yeah.
Yeah, biological father very much during that time. They certainly see him now, but George insisted on adopting the kids, and he was a pretty strong taskmaster. Melissa does not seem to, she stays out of the spotlight altogether. And funny thing about the Jody the pig, or, the spirit, I talked to Lorraine Warren about that, very extensively. She and I had a couple of real long conversations about it. And I said, Lorraine, quite frankly, what do you think about the whole Jody the pig? And she and I both came to the same conclusion, that we actually think Jody the pig or Jody the spirit, this was not anything demonic. We think it was a kid's imaginary playmate.
Right.
Yeah, that was my thinking as well. It's something that she made up to kind of help her get through the situation she was in.
I don't think she was making it up to get through the situation she was in. And I think it was just, she was 5. And she did not seem traumatized. She was a sweet little girl. And so she, at the age of 5, you have not yet reached the age of reason.
True. Now, but all 3 of the kids understood what had occurred in the house as well before they moved in, or shortly after they were told that, this murder happened in this house. If they didn't hear it from the parents, they heard it from the kids at school, right? Like everybody knew.
Well, no, I mean, they knew. I mean, the Lutzes told me that they discussed it with the kid, but how much at the time a 4.5 or a 5, 5, 7, and 9-year-olds really comprehend is debatable.
Right.
Certainly.
Well, and I mean, it's also a very individual thing. Like, it depends on where they're at in their own personal, age aside, right? Like, people mature differently.
Yes. I mean, so they didn't know, but I mean, I think that when you have a situation like this, I certainly would not want to move into a house, even if I could get it for $1, a year after 6 people have been violently murdered in their beds, and then including 4 children.
Right.
I mean, or, debatable. Dawn rather was 18, but so she was
technically an adult. Yeah.
Technically an adult, but just.
Yeah.
But then you have 13, 12, and 9. And then I certainly would not want to buy that house and live in it a year later and buy much of the furniture to boot, including the beds.
The beds, yeah.
Exactly. And nothing much at that point had been changed in the house.
Yeah, my understanding is a lot of the furniture was in the same position as where it was left from the DeFeos. Like, they didn't even move the furniture; just it was there, and they left it there and hopped in bed.
Well, Kathy cleaned it extensively. She did tell me how she was, scrubbing the walls with Lysol and Clorox and whatever to get the blood out, because it was still there. I mean, the police, after they went in and, did all of the dusted for prints and forensics, ended up, not cleaning it up. And of course, the DeFeo and families and Briganti families certainly at that point did not want anything, to do with it,
Right.
So, and you can't blame them. They had just lost, daughters, brothers,
nieces, nephews, grandchildren. Yeah.
And of course it was all over the news. So
after you got the call to interview George and Kathy Lutz, you were covering this for a company that you were working for?
Well, I was working at Channel 5 News in New York. I started to work for them first as an intern while I was at Fordham University. And then I got paid, part-time, etc. And then I was I became a full-time news assistant. So ironically, what happened was Mark Monsky, who was the news director, had assigned me to produce a series on psychic phenomenon on the occult, which meant, get a hold of, people to interview. And at the time, as I'm doing this, guess what? The story breaks, William Weber, DeFeo's court-appointed defense attorney, holds a press conference in conjunction with George and Kathy Lutz to talk about how they had fled the house in terror after 30 days. So, wow. Talk about auspicious.
Stroke of luck, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Auspicious timing. But what happened at the time, and again, for all of your audience here, your listeners, you have to take us back to the, the dark ages before there was such a thing as mobile phones, cable 24-hour news,
right,
etc. All of those things, the internet,
right.
There
was, I don't even think there was cordless phones in 1975, 1976.
No, there wasn't. The best you could do at the time, in 1976, if you were in Manhattan and things, you had the new phone services coming in, like call waiting, call forwarding, three-way calling.
Yes,
you had very expensive, at the time, state-of-the-art, but very, what we consider today, very clunky car phones. So all of the news, the cop cars, the news cars had them. But yeah, so once the Lutzes went public with that story, wow, everybody wanted it. So, of course, Mark Monsky told me, get the story. There was just one problem. Nobody knew where the Lutzes went. So you had to try and call William Weber and his partner, Bernie Burton, to get access to the Lutzes. In fact, they had gone to live with Kathy's mother at her house. But you couldn't reach them. So, and William Weber was preparing to do this whole full court media press, and have Channel 7 Eyewitness News, which was the ABC affiliate, go in with a coven of white witches and a vampireologist to exorcise the house. And when I was calling him trying to get access to George and Kathy in those early days, this would have been late January, early February, he kept saying, okay, I'll relay the message. And I was trying to tell him, well, I had worked with Hans Holzer. I had known Ed and Lorraine Warren and people like that. And he said, well, Channel 5 can come in too and film this exorcism with the coven of white witches and the vampireologist and, along with Channel 7. So I'm sure if William Weber had his way, you would have had the entire New York press corps in there. But what happened was somewhere along the line, George and Kathy stopped dealing with William Weber. They had a split. So I guess I called George's office. He had the Parry company surveying firm, which was his family's land surveying company out on the island. And I spoke to one of the people who worked with him for him and left a long detailed message saying, look, I'd really like to help them. I work at Channel 5 News, but I have a lot of experience, covering, doing paranormal investigations, although nobody called it paranormal investigations back in the 70s. But I basically gave, my little highlight
resume.
Yeah, my little resume, and left a message for him to call me we had the private line. I gave him my direct line at Channel 5 and then the private lines. And I was out of the office covering a story, and I came back and they said to me he had called in on the private line, the phone bank that was right at the, command central, the assignment desk. And they knew who he was. So they tried to get him to talk to one of the other reporters, but he said, no, he wanted to talk to Laura DiDio. So I called him back right away, spoke to him, and he says, can you come out tomorrow to meet with Kathy and I at the surveying company offices? So I said, sure. So at that point, I didn't tell anybody at Channel 5, because you have to understand, I'm 19 or 20 years old, and all I could think of was I'd better under promise and over deliver rather than because I'm thinking, okay, if I don't get the story, I'm not going to be able to keep this $150 a week job. And I'll be working in the
that's smart thinking. Yeah.
I had visions of my career, my next career move would be, working as a salesperson in the shoe department of the local department store. And certainly there's nothing wrong with that, but
that wasn't your aspiration, right?
Yes, exactly. That wasn't my aspiration. So I went out and I met with them for 5 hours.
Wow.
And I listened to them talk, and Kathy, so if they were acting, let me just put it this way. And, I'm from New York. I had been, working at internships in news departments for a couple of years at that point. So I wouldn't say exactly, Christiana Monpour, but I wasn't some starry-eyed, I wasn't Brenda Starr either, starry-eyed person who was naive. I knew that I had to go back to the station and tell my bosses, okay, do I think this is real or not? What about it? And the tale that they were telling me was very incredible. Kathy, and if they were actors, they were the Meryl Streep and Robert De Niro of their day.
So they were extremely genuine. They came across to you as genuine.
Yes, they were extremely convincing. George was very wired, very uptight, but Kathy was, she talked with a very soft, quiet voice, reminiscent of, a Jackie Kennedy or a Marilyn Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
And she spoke in very halting terms, and she was hugging herself. I mean, and looking down when she talked. I mean, their fear and their terror was very real. But at the same time, what they described happened to them. They were basically visited by almost every supernatural plague or occurrence other than, Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman.
Right.
Which you have to say is hard to believe. And I have all of my original notes from that time. And I was, living at home with my parents. And I came back in and I told my mom what they had told me, flies and, smells and could never get cold, and personality. Their personalities had apparently been altered, where they were acting like drill sergeants. They were abusive towards the kids. They weren't getting along with each other. They never wanted to leave the house. George's personal hygiene, was suffering. He didn't want to take a bath. He was, constantly outside, doing things, but and they said no animals wanted to go on the property. That wasn't really quite true, though. And just that, things were changing, and what happened that last night, they were vague on what actually triggered, what the catalyst was that caused them to flee in terror. But they, there were claims in Anson's book, Jay Anson's subsequent book, about doors being ripped off hinges, green slime. Now, George did talk about this green slime or primordial ooze. We did not see any of that.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that when I went back, and they said, after spending the 5 hours with them on that Saturday, I then went back into the office on Monday and said, okay, they've said, I met with them, we have the exclusive. And they said, don't talk to William Weber anymore. We're not talking to him. I said, okay, fine. And very early on, by the way, and this is an important point, William Weber has said that he and the Lutzes concocted the story of the haunting over several bottles of wine. Okay, The Lutzes actually played me the tape when I went and met them on the second occasion. I went out to Kathy's mother's house on a Saturday night. Notice I'm doing all this, this is
weekend work. Yeah.
Passion for the job to make sure I was going to be, gainfully employed. And they played me the tape that they had made, a little cassette recording with William Weber. And in fact, they said to me before they played it, they said, look, we're not really proud of this. So on the tape, you do hear William Weber and the Lutzes talking about, the plan was to put the house in a trust, and they would do a 4-way split of money between Weber, his partner Bernie Burton, and George and Kathy, to almost, make it like a haunted house attraction, charge money, etc. And even at that point, William Weber was saying, well, there's at least 2 movies and 3 books out of this, which sounds like a pretty daring, ambitious scheme at the time. Right. But even William Weber couldn't have believed how, where this would lead. And I remember on the tape very, very vividly, George said, listen, I don't want the children involved in any of this. They are to be kept out of it. We don't want them in any way, portrayed or paraded out for the media. And I clearly remember William Weber saying, oh, no, don't worry about that. No, the children, God bless them, they'll be kept out of this. But it sounded like Tiny Tim, God bless us one and all. Right. So when the tape finished, and they were saying, things like, well, we could say this happened at this such and such a time, etc. So when the tape finished, they said, what do you think of that? We're ashamed of this. And we want you to know that we're not involved with William Weber anymore, and we don't want to do any of this. Do you still want to talk to us? And I said, well, I think that if you really were haunted, that what you really have to do is get help for your, professional help for you and your family. And what I can do is introduce you to some legitimate paranormal investigators. And that was Ed and Lorraine Warren. So we arranged, I originally called Hans Holzer, but Hans, who had done a documentary back in the late 60s with Channel 5 on Aaron Burr's former house and stables in Greenwich Village, which at the time was the Cafe Bazaar. It was a discotheque. It was one of their highest rated documentaries. Hans Holzer said to me, well, we need to do this right, and we need to do a documentary, etc. I said, well, no, this is not the entertainment division of Metro Media. This is the news division, and it's down, dirty, and cheap. It's, murder and mayhem at 10 o'clock. So he wasn't interested, and nobody knew. It wasn't a big story at that point. So the next people on our list were Ed and Lorraine Warren, and I called them, up at their place in Monroe, Connecticut, and they answered the phone right away. And I had interviewed them before, and they had also been interviewed by Marvin Scott on a story about a haunted church. So they were known locally, but not nationally at that point.
Right.
And they said, tell us about the case. And I told them, and I said, can you come down here tomorrow to go out to the house with us? And they said, yeah. And the only thing the Warrens asked for, Hans wanted to be paid, which, for his time, he wanted the station to do it right and do a full-blown documentary. That wasn't what we were doing in the news department. We wanted a news story. The Warrens didn't ask for anything. All they asked for was, can you pay our gas and tolls? And I said, yes.
Excellent.
And so they came down the next day, and Steve Bauman, who was the investigative reporter at Channel 5, had won multiple Emmys. By the way, nobody at Channel 5 except me and the news director, Mark Monsky, were enthusiastic about this story. It was a big joke.
Right.
And there is no doubt in anyone's mind that whether or not this story was proven to be a hoax, that we were going to cover it, because that haunted houses, as Marvin Scott has always said, are big ratings grabbers. Everybody wants a good ghost story. So we went out to Amityville, and a series of calamities happened. We were supposed to meet George Lutz in front of the house so we could get the keys to go in. He wasn't there. Lorraine and I tried to phone him, and the pay phone booth. You remember those things that Superman used to change in?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I think there's still maybe one or two around in New York City. They do have them, I think, in London. But we were using the pay phone booth, and it was just a lot of static. And somebody knocked on the booth door for us to get out of there so they could make a phone call. The guy went in. He made a phone call with no problem. Lorraine and I went back into the phone booth after that man exited. Still nothing. So I said, what is going on? And Lorraine called it diabolical interference. She wasn't surprised. So after a bunch of mishaps, and we finally went down to the police station and asked them to call George for us, try a couple of numbers for him. And finally, after a bunch of mishaps, he did come out and meet us at the house. He refused. Steve Bauman tried his best to get George to go back into the house with us, and he refused. He claimed that he was getting sick just standing in front of the house. He wanted nothing to do with it. So we went in that first night with Ed and Lorraine, and Lorraine really felt oppressive stuff. She went in, she sat on the bed in the master bedroom where Ronnie Sr. and his wife Louise DeFeo were killed, and she knew that was, one of the main murder rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And she could feel Louise. We went into what was the sewing room. I think that was Allison's room. And she felt ill. She picked up the vibrations of the little girl being killed there. And she felt very ill and got a headache on the stairs near the second floor landing.
Okay.
So we went back to the station. Steve cut the piece. It ran, and the phones lit up like you would not believe. So from day one, this story was huge, and people wanted more and more about it. And Steve did he did an interview with William Weber there out on the front lawn, talking to him about it. And of course, at this point, since Weber was no longer involved in the story, he got very involved in debunking it, as did the so-called vampirologist. So very early on, there was a schism. You know, if they couldn't make money promoting this as a true haunting, then they were going to make, you know, anybody who was not involved directly with the Lutzes in promoting it as a true story were going to try and debunk it.
Right.
So when we actually arranged for the seance, what I called the psychic slumber party, which took place March 6th, 1976, Steve Bauman very abruptly decided to go on vacation with his wife that weekend. And Marvin Scott was informed at like 2:00. Marvin Scott was the weekend anchor at Channel 5, 10 o'clock news. Marvin is being told he's got to cover this story, and they were getting somebody to be the weekend anchor for him, you know, take over his anchoring duties. So when I called into the station to look for Steve and was told he wasn't there, I said, "What do you mean he isn't there? We're supposed to be out at Amityville at 5 or 6 o'clock tonight." Marvin quick picked up the phone and said, "Brief me on this story. Give me the background." And it was a big deal at Channel 5 because we had to hire one of our regular freelance crews to cover it at time and a half. And
because it was taking place in the middle of the night.
Well, on a Saturday night. March 6th was a Saturday night. And so we were having to pay the crews time and a half. I also was getting time and a half. By the way, I made a rousing $165 in overtime for that one night. I was ecstatic because it exceeded what my paycheck for the week did. I was like, yes. Again, I was a lowly, you know, TV news assistant. And they also had to buy us sandwiches and sodas. So that was supposedly breaking the budget. It's funny when you think about it in hindsight, but what had happened on this was that the thing grew. So Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were supposed to be leading, I wouldn't quite call it an exorcism, but, you know, a cleansing of the house or an investigation, they had invited a few people, several psychic friends. The Lutzes had invited a few people, unbeknownst to us, somebody from the National Star, somebody who was loosely affiliated with Duke University, although not directly employed by the university, Dream Lab. So there were 3 or 4 more people there. As I said, Ed and Lorraine Warren brought, they had a photographer. They had 2 other psychic friends, one of the psychic's friends' husbands. Then the Lutzes had invited several other parapsychology researchers. So altogether, there was, you know, between us and a 3-man film crew, myself, Marvin Scott, there were about 20, and there was Mike Linder from WNEW Radio, which was Channel 5's radio station affiliate. He was there. So you had about 20, 25 people in the house that night. It was lit up from, you know, attic to basement. It was not like the movie Poltergeist by any means. It wasn't even House on Haunted Hill. But several things did happen. Certainly the psychics felt things. But the most notable things that happened was during the seance, I was sitting between Marvin Scott and Mike Linder, and at one point, Marvin said to me, "Hey, I just felt a chill." Okay, and then 5 minutes later, Mike Linder on my left said, "Hey, I just felt a chill." Also during the seance, one of the psychics got up screaming, said, "It's in the second floor bedroom," and ran screaming out of the room. Another one got sick and ran out on the side lawn and vomited.
Oh my.
And then one of the other researchers left the room as well. So, but I can't tell you that, people getting sick or the psychics' reactions, if that was real. What I can say is that Steve Petropoulos, who was our cameraman, when we first got there, he started walking up the stairway, that first, from the first to the second floor. And halfway up the stairs, he turned around, he looked at me, he says, the room on the second floor, first door on the right, he says, that room is filled with mirrors. And that was the master bedroom, which one wall was all mirrors, like in Vegas.
Right.
And he turned around, he said to me, I don't know how I knew that. So Steve then proceeded up the stairs with his light meter. He did not have his camera with him at that time. And he got to the top of the stairs and he turned around and I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and he looked at me and his face, the color drained out of it. And he started clutching his chest, at which point the other crew members ran up, assisted him down the stairs, sitting at the bottom, and gave him some water. And he said he was having heart palpitations, and that had never happened to him before.
Interesting.
And but other than that, when you have a party atmosphere in the house, you can't
probably
really,
not going to get a lot of
exactly. And Ed Warren called a halt to the proceedings at about 3:30, 4 o'clock. He said, the house is just, needs to settle down. We can't accomplish anything here.
It's too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, well, too many cooks in the kitchen. And so there was nobody who was really leading things. It wasn't like there was one central person who was directing all of the action. It was rather haphazard. And once we came back and we did a 2-part, and Marvin Scott said, I don't think we have it. And he took Lorraine upstairs into Allison's bedroom, what had been Allison's bedroom and Missy's bedroom later, Missy Lutz, and tried to talk to her about her impressions. But it sort of looked like somebody sitting in a darkened room with just candles, which is what it was. Again, it was not like Poltergeist or The Exorcist or anything, dramatic that you could, or the movie Twister, where you see tornadoes all over the place. So, but regardless of that, and Mike Linder filed a story for WNEW Radio. He went upstairs to sleep in one of the bedrooms, woke up the next morning, and he was alone in the house. And the story he wrote, the story he filed, the audio that he filed for the radio station was coming to you from the not so haunted house in Amityville, because Mike was a staunch disbeliever and skeptic. I'm Mike Linder. Well, his phone's lit up. As soon as we did the 2-part series on that, again, the public's appetite for this story was and remains insatiable. Again, our phones lit up, and I was getting calls on it because as soon as they called the switchboard, they directed all calls to me. And for months afterwards, you had people calling up and saying, hey, could we go and spend the night in the house? Kids, teenagers, but also adults as well. It just refused to, pardon the pun, die.
Right. Well, and it still hasn't.
No, I mean, it's just, Amityville has become a brand now. You just say Amityville and boom, people associate it. I mean, they just keep making more far-fetched stories.
Like the remakes and
which
sequels and spin-offs, and
which have nothing to do with the original story. And what's been obscured to a large extent is that 6 people were tragically murdered there.
Yeah.
I mean, and that the Lutz family was, pretty much torn apart by it. At least, the kids the kids were. I mean, Eric, when you meet with Christopher, and I've also spoken to Christopher, what sense do you have of him still being troubled or haunted by it?
I wouldn't say it's
not that he's in terror because he thinks demons are following him, but just the entire experience of what it's done to his life.
Oh yeah, it still traumatizes him and it still bothers him. I think that's why one of the reasons why he changed his name back to Quarantino, his mother's maiden name, and
no, actually Quarantino is his father's name.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, his mother's maiden name was Connors.
Right.
Changed his name back because I think he wanted to reclaim his identity.
Exactly, that's what I meant. I think from talking with him, he had enough of the story, and it still was being brought up to this day, and he kind of wanted some closure from it and to get away from it. And the impression I got is he didn't want to no longer be associated with it. That's the impression I got from talking to him.
But he can't get away from it, and neither can Danny.
No, unfortunately.
And Danny, who has had the most virulent reaction and antipathy towards George, has retained the name of Lutz. And I asked Danny about that when I did the documentary with Eric Walter back in 2012, 2013, my Amityville Horror. And I said, how come you haven't changed your name back? Because you claim to despise, George so much. And basically, I got a very desultory, well, I haven't had time, or it's too complicated, I haven't had the money. But Christopher made the time. And, thankfully, he's in touch with his biological father. They're close. And he was very close to his mother. But the whole experience, I think, with both boys was that they were ridiculed quite a bit about this thing being a hoax. And Danny said to me, I just wanted somebody to believe me. And Christopher pretty much says the same thing. And while they both say, yes, a lot of things have been exaggerated, both Danny and Christopher, as you pointed out, Eric, say things did happen.
Yeah.
Both of them are adamant. Did Chris tell you about the dark figure that came into the bedroom one night?
No, he didn't mention that. But he did tell me some of the other things that happened, like the dog that ended up almost hanging itself over the fence, somehow magically ended up over the fence and was hanging itself, and George had to rush and rescue it. And some of the other things he talked about, he didn't go into detail about any dark figures, but he did say when we talked that there were things that happened in that house, and there was definitely things that he couldn't explain. But again, a lot of what was in the book and of course the film was over exaggerated. A lot of those things didn't happen. Yes. But as you mentioned, he was, I think it was 7 years old at the time, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he said he had some memories of it, but a lot of the stuff he couldn't remember specifically. So I think just talking with him, the impression I got was he wasn't traumatized necessarily by what happened in the house, but the aftermath that followed.
Exactly. And I think the way the relationship he had with his stepfather. Again, if you listen to Danny on the My Amityville Horror documentary, he came out and said he tried to kill George. He tried to smack him over the head with something. I mean, that's a 9-year-old boy, a 10-year-old boy. And Danny did end up leaving home when he was 16, left Arizona and came back to New York. And of all things, now this is a real coincidence. In New York, even the boroughs, Queens, Brooklyn, Long Island, that's a big place. Danny ended up being a UPS driver for many years And his route was my hometown of College Point. We opened the door one time. My mother answered the door, and there's Danny Lutz. What are the chances? That's a real coincidence. But
a lot of coincidences with Amityville, it seems like.
Yes, and then there are some things that are not a coincidence. There are a lot of coincidences. So the most vivid one that I had was in May 2006. I was sitting here in my home office and I'm writing a report, and all of a sudden the thought jumped into my head, I have to call Lorraine Warren. And I hadn't spoken to Lorraine in about a year, but it wasn't one of those things like, oh, you know, I need to call so-and-so so we can get together for lunch, or we haven't chatted in a while. This was, no, I have to call Lorraine Warren, and I have to call her now. Picked up the phone, called Lorraine. She answered. I said to her, hey, Lorraine, you just jumped into my head, and I just really had a compulsion to call you right now. How have you been, etc. And we were chatting, and of course we chatted a lot, you know, about Amityville and things that had happened. And Lorraine always maintained that that was the closest to hell she had ever been, and she thought that was her scariest case. So as we were on the phone for about 2.5 hours, later that night, I see these news reports that George Lutz had suffered a massive heart attack and died out in Las Vegas at the exact time that Lorraine and I were on the phone. So I'm like,
wow,
oh, that's spooky. And I called Lorraine up the next day. It was too late. I didn't want to call her at 11 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
I called her up the next day and said, Lorraine, did you see the stuff about George Lutz passed away? She said, I said, Lorraine, you heard me say to you yesterday when I called you that I felt a compulsion. I had to call you now. And I said, he was having the heart attack and dying at the exact time you and I were on the phone. And Lorraine just said, uh-huh. Mm-hmm. She wasn't surprised. Well,
I was going to say, you probably weren't surprised that she wasn't surprised.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm saying it just came into my head. So the takeaway from this, Marie, is that even if you don't have, we all have psychic abilities, just like everybody can learn to play the piano, run a 5K race, or most of us, ride a bike. But that doesn't, I can ride a bike, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be competing in the Tour de France.
Right.
However, if you hang around with paranormal investigators and psychics long enough, in my case, all I'm saying is I think some of it, rubbed off a little, because that was definitely a premonition. And
right.
The other big thing that I had, I decided after the seance, because nothing much, quote unquote, had happened for the cameras, that I was going to go back into the house by myself a week or two later. And I took my dog Fritz with me, who was a Shepherd Lab mix. And I was walking around the house, and again, all the Lutz's furniture was still there. The gingerbread house that Kathy had made for the kids for Christmas was still there. Everything, it just looked like the family had gone out for the day. And as I'm walking around the house, I hear my dog, who was off the leash, and he was in the front hallway, and I hear the dog growling. So I go out to investigate, and my dog is standing there. And this was a very calm dog, by the way, who's used to a lot of big city noises, other animals, things like this. He's standing at the foot of the stairs in the center foyer, and he's staring. He's standing stock still, and he's staring up at a place on the second floor landing where Lorraine had fallen, didn't feel well, where Steve Petropoulos had his heart palpitations, right by the little ghost boy picture in that doorway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And all the hackles are up on the dog's, from his neck all the way down to his tailbone. And he's got his ears pinned back and he's growling. And this was a very friendly dog. And he was very calm. If Fritz were alive today, I think he would be one of those dogs that was an empath that could sense a heart attack, an epileptic or diabetic seizure, etc. And so I'm standing there and I'm just looking, and he's got his eyes fixed on something. It's like he can see something that I can't. And I started to go up the stairs and I said, probably not a good idea, Laura. You're not supposed to be in the house technically anyway by yourself. But all I had in my mind was those 50s horror movies, you know, where the damsel in distress is running through the woods in high heels.
Yes.
And trips and the monster gets her. Well, it wasn't quite like that because it was a sunny day and I had my dog there. But the dog's reaction, which I had never seen before. I mean, if a squirrel or a cat went through the yard, he would chase it. You know, but his friendly dog. But he didn't overreact to things. So the fact that he was having this very odd reaction.
Especially at that specific point in the house where, you know, other things had occurred.
Yeah, and if there was a squirrel in the attic or something, he wouldn't have reacted that way.
No, yeah.
If there was a person there, you know, my grandmother lived in one of my grandmothers lived in a 2-family house, and her landlady and landlord had a grown son. And I was over there one day and Fritz was upstairs and the son had grown a beard and he didn't live with his parents anymore. And he came into the house to go into the house and Fritz was standing, you know, at the top of the stair landing, and the son, guy named Larry, came in and Fritz charged down the stairs after him like he was an intruder.
Because of the beard.
Yes, he didn't recognize him and he hadn't seen him, so he was being protective. So my point is, if he had thought that there was a human up there, he would have gone up.
Yeah. Instead,
he was standing there with a fixed stare like he could see something and sense something and I couldn't.
Oh, spooky. So you turned tail, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, I admit it. I have a yellow streak, you know.
Girl, you were in the Amityville house. I would have done the same thing.
It was the dog. I trusted the dog's instinct.
Yes.
People can sit there and they can say, okay, well, these psychics were just playing for the cameras and grandstanding when they said, oh, okay, this is here, and run out and get sick. But what happened with our cameraman, Steve, and at that point, again, Steve didn't know the whole history of the house. He lived in New Jersey, and it wasn't a huge story at that point. But when nobody told my dog, Fritz, that 6 people had been murdered there and that the house was supposed to be haunted. By the way, when it comes to the haunting part, Lorraine Warren has always felt it was, and Ed Warren felt that it was a demonic presence. Hans Holzer felt that it was a simple haunting. I went into the house again 7 months later with Hans Holzer and his medium that he worked with, Ethel Johnson Myers, and she went into a deep trance, and she felt, and she was the one, that was when we found out the house was built from the research I had done on an Indian burial ground.
Interesting.
And she said that what came through was the spirit of a young teenaged Indian boy he said his skeletal remains, well, his skull had been found by some local kids and they were kicking it around like a football, and he was pretty upset about it. For years, by the way, the Amityville Historical Society debunked the notion that there was an Indian burial ground there. And then it came out, we found, you know, I had seen the original newspaper clippings when I first investigated, and when I went back a week later to the Amityville Historical Society, they were gone. So for years, as I said, the Amityville Historical Society denied that there were any Indian burial grounds there. And when I say burial grounds, you have to understand that Native Americans were all over Long Island. You know,
Sure.
the Monhegan tribe, you had the Shinnecocks, you know, various tribes, and they hung out near water. I mean, my own town of College Point in Queens, which was on the water, we had the Matinacock Indians. Those are all part of the Algonquin Nation. Anyway, so finally, what has happened more recently is that these things have resurfaced. The articles from 1895, the local newspapers talking about the remains of, you know, Indian skeletons, Native American skeletons have been found on Ocean Avenue. So those stories have, newspaper accounts have been unearthed again, if you will. So it is true.
Very interesting. Laura, I can't thank you enough for coming on and telling us your story. You have a very unique viewpoint and experience with the Amityville haunting, the Lutz, the Warrens, Hans Holzer, you know, all of it. It's just, I could talk to you for hours. Unfortunately, we're running against the clock. But I'd love to have you back on.
Yes, definitely. I'd love to come out and tell you some of the things that I'm working on now with one of the most powerful psychic mediums that I have ever encountered, spirit messenger, and that's Vicki Monroe, who's based in Maine. And she and I are also collaborating with Eric Walter on some new things, and it should be exciting. But you know, Vicky's amazing with some of the stuff that she does. It's incredible. So we'd love to come back and talk to you.
Yeah, we'll have you back on. Thank you again for taking the time to tell us these stories, because you're, you know, like I said, like one of the few air quote lucky people that got to kind of experience the Amityville as it was unfolding and occurring. So thank you again for coming on. And until the next episode, stay scared.